an artificial intelligence to match human intelligence, might reconstructing the intricacies of the human brain be the key. And would this even be possible? This was the original goal of the artificial neural network, a computational model designed to imitate the human brain. Our brains are made up of 86 billion neurons. A neuron is a specialised cell that transmits information through electrical and chemical signals to process information and drive behaviour. Artificial neural networks are composed of artificial neurons, which are simplified mathematical models of biological neurons. They receive inputs, apply a function to determine the combined effect of the inputs, and produce an output that is sent to other neurons. However, it wasn't possible to exactly mimic the human brain using these artificial neural networks, since many of the inner workings of the human brain are a complete and total mystery to us. And it would be simply impossible to copy something that we just don't know. Instead, artificial neural networks are only loosely based on the architecture of the human brain. However, they are still powerful tools that we come into contact with every day. Watched Netflix recently? Well, how did it know what shows and movies to recommend to you? Used Face ID to unlock your phone today? How did it recognise your face from amongst the other 8 billion people on this planet? And how did YouTube know to recommend you this video? The answer to each of those questions is the same, and that answer is that they all use neural networks to solve these problems. But what exactly is a neural network? And how does one work? A neural network is simply a computer program which emulates the human brain. It is a form of machine learning known as deep learning. We feed this program large amounts of data, and it learns from this data by finding and using patterns to make predictions and decisions. They are so useful to us because they can easily learn and improve from examples, which helps them to solve complex problems that would be difficult to tackle with traditional programming. This makes them adepts at completing tasks like translating languages, recommending movies, and forecasting the weather. An artificial neural network is made up of neurons arranged into groups called layers. The first layer, that takes in the original numbers, is called the input layer. The final layer that provides us with the output is the output layer, and all the layers in between are called hidden layers. If you've ever come across the term deep neural network, that's just a neural network that contains more than one hidden layer. To understand how a neural network works as a whole, let's look a bit deeper into how a single neuron works. The inputs that are fed into a single neuron undergo a 3-step process. The first step is to multiply the inputs by weights. But what are these weights? A weight in a neural network is a number that scales an input value. Each neuron has a set of weights, and these influence the neuron's output by adjusting the significance of the input in the neural computation. We multiply each input by its corresponding weight and add the resulting values together. We now have what's known as the weighted sum. If you're familiar with linear algebra, then we can say that we're calculating the dot product between the input vector and the weights vector. We then add a constant value to the weighted sum. This value is known as the bias, and its purpose is to adjust the output of the neuron to help the model better fit the data. This new value that we've just calculated is fed as the input into a function known as the activation function. Activation functions determine whether and to what extent a neuron should activate. These functions allow the network to make sense of complicated, intricate relationships between the inputs. Without activation functions, neural networks would be limited to linear relationships, leaving them unable to understand the complex and varied patterns typically found in the real world. The output of the activation function is the output of the neuron itself. Neurons don't exist by themselves, so let's zoom out and look at the network as a whole. As we mentioned earlier, neurons exist in groups called layers. The group of inputs, also known as the input vector, that is passed to a single layer is passed to every neuron in that layer to undergo the computations that we just discussed. We get one number as an output from each individual neuron, which means that overall, for a single layer, we get as many outputs as there are neurons. And this group of outputs is known as the output vector. The output vector of one layer is passed as the input vector to the layer that comes after it. And the output vector of the output layer is the end result of the whole neural network. The input layer to the neural network works differently to the other layers. It serves as a gateway through which the initial data enters the network, so its primary function is to receive individual data points and pass them on to the next layer. The neurons in the input layer do not perform any computations on the data. Each neuron in the input layer is connected to every neuron in the first hidden layer, and it is here that the actual processing starts to happen using weights and biases. At this point, there's one main question we've still left unanswered. Neural networks are a form of machine learning, but where on earth's the learning part? The learning takes place in the training phase, where the neural network learns which weights and biases it should use in order to give us the most accurate output possible. We need a set of data for this, which our network will learn from. The dataset will contain inputs related to the inputs that we would want to feed the neural network when using it for real, and it also contains their corresponding outputs. Depending on the application of the neural network, the dataset used for training might not need outputs, but for simplicity in this video they will. Before the neural network has undergone this training phase, we start by setting all weights and biases to random values. We then pass data from the training set into the neural network and receive an output. Since we know what the output should be from the dataset, we can compare the actual output to the output computed by the neural network to see how well the neural network performed. The calculation we use to do this is known as the loss function, and the larger the output of this function, the less accurate our neural network is. The aim of training the neural network is to minimize this value given by the loss function. Based on this, the neural network adjusts its weights and biases, and we repeat this process until the model becomes accurate. The neural network has therefore learned what weights and biases it should use in order to produce an accurate output. For an example, let's see how we could use a neural network to predict movie box office revenues. As inputs, we will use the factors of budget, runtime, and the number of theatres in which the movie will initially be released. To create such a neural network, we'll need a dataset containing the budget, runtime, number of theatres, and the box office revenue for a lot of films. We'll then need to decide on the structure for the neural network. For this, we'll just keep it simple. Our neural network will contain an input layer with 3 neurons, a hidden layer with 4 neurons, another hidden layer with 2 neurons, and an output layer with 1 neuron. We'll set each neuron with random weights and biases, and then feed our data through the neural network, comparing the outputs we receive with the actual outputs from the dataset using the loss function, adjusting the weights and biases accordingly to make the model more accurate. Once the training phase is complete, we can use our neural network to predict the revenue of a movie that has yet to be released. Say there's a movie coming out next week, and we've been given its figures for budget, runtime, and the number of theatres it will be released in. Then, we can use our neural network to predict its box office revenue. The input layer contains 3 neurons, each one corresponding to one of the input values. No computation occurs here. The input layer just receives the raw data values and passes them to the first hidden layer in the form of a vector. Let's take a look at how one of the neurons in the first hidden layer would deal with this input vector that has been passed to it. Since a neuron is being passed 3 values, it needs 3 weights, one for each input. The weights have already been configured correctly during the training phase. We multiply each input with its corresponding weight and then add the results together. We then add the neuron's bias to this value. The node will have a specific activation function associated with it, and we pass the result to this function. ReLU is a common activation function which would likely be used here, and it gives us, as output, the input value if the input value is positive, otherwise it outputs 0. The same calculations take place within each neuron in the first hidden layer, and each neuron outputs a single value, which we can combine to give us the output vector. This output vector becomes the input vector for the second hidden layer, and the output of the second hidden layer is passed as the input to the output layer. The output layer will then output the predicted box office revenue for the film.